The story of Zain and Champa. An unusual encounter. Roshanpur was a village where life moved with utter simplicity and natural beauty. Lush green fields, the melodious chirping of birds, and the earthy scent of the soil were the hallmarks of this peaceful place. In a small mud house located at the edge of the village lived 12-year-old Zain with his elderly grandfather. Zain's parents had tragically passed away in an accident when he was just a toddler, and his grandfather had raised him ever since. Zain was an incredibly intelligent, kind-hearted, and hard-working boy, but there was a deep loneliness in his life that often made him sad. One afternoon, a fierce storm struck the village. Lightning crackled across the sky and torrential rain poured down. Zain was returning from the nearby forest path, balancing a heavy bundle of firewood on his shoulders. Suddenly, from behind the thick wild bushes, he heard a faint, piteous whimpering sound. Conquering his fear, Zain gently parted the thorny bushes. To his utter amazement, he found a tiny baby monkey there, barely a few months old, severely injured. Its leg was bleeding profusely, and its fragile body was shivering violently from the freezing rain. Zain's heart melted completely. He dropped his bundle of firewood right there, took off his old warm shawl, and carefully wrapped the shivering creature in it. "Don't be afraid, my little friend. You are safe now," Zain whispered softly, trying to comfort the terrified animal. He ran all the way back home through the pouring rain. When his grandfather saw the injured monkey in Zain's arms, he was hesitant at first. However, seeing the pleading look in Zain's eyes, his heart softened. Grandfather immediately prepared a healing paste from medicinal herbs. Zain stayed awake the entire night, nursing the baby monkey, feeding it warm milk drop by drop, and gently bandaging its wound. The next morning, as the warm golden sun filtered through the window, the monkey opened its large, bright, expressive eyes. It looked directly at Zain, who was sitting beside it with a warm smile. Instead of shrinking away in fear, the little monkey reached out and wrapped its tiny fingers around Zain's index finger. It was a profound moment where an unbreakable bond of trust and love was forged between two souls. Zain named him Champa. The deepening friendship. As weeks turned into months, Champa healed completely and grew strong. While he possessed the natural playfulness and mischief of a monkey, his intelligence was extraordinary. He didn't just understand Zain's spoken words, he could read the silent expressions in his eyes and interpret his slightest hand gestures. Champa's entire world revolved around Zain. Whenever Zain went to school, Champa would follow and perch proudly on the school boundary wall, patiently waiting for the closing bell. The moment Zain stepped out, Champa would leap joyfully and sit on his shoulder. The village elders would often smile warmly at the sight of them, joking, "Look, the inseparable brothers are on their way." Champa was far from being just a pet, he became Zain's ultimate helper. He would actively assist Zain and his grandfather with household chores. If something needed to be retrieved from the high roof, or if ripe, juicy mangoes needed to be plucked from the tall trees, Champa would get the job done in mere seconds. One afternoon, a major disaster was averted solely due to Champa's alertness. Grandfather had put some tea to boil over the wood-fire kitchen stove and fell into a deep sleep in his room. Slowly, the firewood sparks caught onto the dry wooden structure of the kitchen, and thick black smoke began to fill the house. Zain was away at school. Sensing the danger, Champa rushed into grandfather's room, frantically tugging at his blanket and screeching. When grandfather woke up, startled, Champa pointed urgently toward the kitchen. Thanks to Champa's timely warning, grandfather managed to extinguish the fire before it could spread. From that day on, Champa was officially treated as a heroic member of the family. The time of trial. The true turning point in the story came when grandfather suddenly fell gravely ill. The village physician examined him and delivered devastating news. Grandfather had a severe liver infection, and he needed to be rushed to a large hospital in the city for an expensive operation. The ground slipped from beneath Zain's feet. Where could a young boy find such a massive amount of money? Desperate, he begged the wealthy village landlord for a loan, but the cruel landlord turned him away empty-handed. Drifting into utter despair, Zain sat in a dark corner of his courtyard and wept bitterly. Champa walked up to him, climbed into his lap, and used his tiny hands to gently wipe away Zain's tears. He cupped Zain's face in his paws, looking at him as if to say, "I am right here with you. Do not lose hope." Zain hugged Champa tightly to his chest. "Champa, if anything happens to grandfather, I won't survive. We have to go to the big city. We have to find a way to earn the money." The very next morning, leaving grandfather in the care of a kind neighbor, Zain and Champa boarded a bus to the sprawling city. The city environment was shockingly different from their peaceful village. the deafening roar of traffic, towering concrete buildings, and a sea of indifferent strangers. Zain knocked on the doors of countless shops and restaurants begging for work, but no one was willing to hire a 12-year-old boy. As evening approached, hungry, thirsty, and thoroughly exhausted, the two sat dejectedly on a wooden bench in a crowded public park. Champa looked at Zain's pale, sorrowful face and decided to take matters into his own hands. He leapt off the bench, marched right into the center of the park walkway, and began performing energetic backflips, somersaults, and acrobatic climbing tricks on a nearby tree. Amused by the monkey's spontaneous and brilliant antics, a large crowd of children and adults quickly gathered around. Zain immediately caught on to Champa's plan. He grabbed an empty cardboard box and began clapping rhythmically to create a beat. Champa delivered his grand finale, balancing perfectly on a wooden stick using only one hand. The crowd erupted into applause and began tossing coins and currency notes into Zain's box. By the time the sun set, the duo had earned enough money to secure a safe room for the night and a hearty meal. It was the beginning of their new journey, but they were entirely unaware of the dark shadow looming over them in the city. Earning money through street performances became their daily routine. Every day, they would travel to different parks, markets, and bustling squares. Champa would showcase his mind-blowing tricks, and Zain would engage the crowd. Word spread quickly, and Champa became known across the city as the magical monkey. People came from far and wide just to catch a glimpse of their show. Every night, Zain would meticulously count the savings, whispering happily to Champa that they were getting closer to saving grandfather. However, beneath the glittering lights of the city lay a sinister underbelly. The owner of a notorious local circus, a brutal and greedy man named Jabbar, had been secretly watching Champa for days. Jabbar was infamous for treating animals with extreme cruelty, whipping them into submission to maximize his profits. Seeing Champa's immense talent, Jabbar's mind filled with pure greed. He realized that if he could capture this unique monkey for his circus, he would become rich overnight. One fateful evening, just as their final performance ended, Zain went inside a medical store to purchase grandfather's prescription medicines. Champa was instructed to sit quietly on a bench outside. Suddenly, a large black van screeched to a halt right in front of the bench. Two burly henchmen jumped out, pressed a cloth laced with chloroform over Champa's face, stuffed his unconscious body into a heavy burlap sack, and threw him into the back of the van. Before darkness consumed Champa's consciousness, the last image he saw was the door of the medical store, unable to even cry out for his friend. When Zain stepped out of the store holding the medicines, the bench was empty. Champa was gone. The only thing left behind was Champa's favorite red handkerchief lying in the dirt. Champa, Champa, where are you? Zain's heart pounded frantically against his ribs. He ran wildly through the marketplace, searched every dark alleyway, and begged bystanders for information, but no one had seen anything. Night fell, and a cold rain began to pour, but Zain continued to run through the slippery streets like a madman, screaming his friend's name until his voice turned hoarse. Collapsing onto the pavement, he wept uncontrollably. Champa, please come back. How am I supposed to save grandfather without you? Captivity and defiance. Meanwhile, when Champa finally regained consciousness, he found himself locked inside a cramped, filthy iron cage. The air around him was filled with the mournful cries of other captive animals, a depressed lion, two sickly parrots, and a badly injured bear. They were all prisoners of Jabbar's traveling circus. Jabbar walked into the dimly lit holding area, menacingly tapping a thick leather whip against his leather boots. He stopped right in front of Champa's cage. Well, my little prize. You belong to me now. If you perform nicely in my show, you get to eat. If you refuse, this whip will tear your skin apart. Champa bared his teeth, rattling the iron bars with pure fury, but he was powerless. Jabbar tossed a piece of stale, moldy bread into the cage, but Champa refused to touch it. He sat in the corner, longing for the warmth of his true friend Zain, who always fed him fresh food with his own hands and let him sleep safely against his chest. Champa made a silent, stubborn vow. He would never bow down to this cruel tyrant. For the next 3 days, Champa went on a total hunger strike and refused to perform a single trick. Jabbar whipped him out of anger, but instead of whimpering in fear, Champa's eyes blazed with defiance and unwavering loyalty to Zain. Back in the city, Zain had refused to give up. He spent all his remaining money printing missing posters featuring Champa's picture, pasting them on every wall. Following a vague tip from a street vendor, Zain walked miles to the desolate outskirts of the city, where a massive circus tent was pitched. The moment Zain saw the circus banner, his heart leapt. His soul knew that his best friend was trapped somewhere inside that tent. Overhead the midnight rescue and flight. Zain hid in the shadows, waiting patiently for the cover of midnight. Once the final show concluded, the lights were extinguished, and the tired security guards fell asleep, Zain stealthily scaled the high perimeter wall and slipped into the compound. Moving like a ghost, he navigated through the shadows until he reached the rear tents where the animal cages were kept. Suddenly, a soft, familiar squeak echoed through the dark. Even in the pitch blackness, Champa had instantly recognized the scent and footsteps of his beloved friend. Champa, Zain gasped, rushing over to the cage. Tears flowed freely down both their faces. As Champa extended his tiny arms through the narrow iron bars, tenderly caressing Zain's cheeks. "Don't cry, Champa, I am getting you out of here right now," Zain whispered determinedly. He looked around, picked up a massive, heavy rock, and began striking the iron padlock with all his might. The lock was thick, but the strength driving Zain's arms was fueled by pure, unadulterated love. After 3 shattering blows, the lock snapped open. Champa burst out of the cage and threw his arms tightly around Zain's neck. However, the loud clanging of the metal awakened the circus hounds, who began barking fiercely. Within seconds, Jabbar and his armed guards woke up. "Who's there? Catch them. Don't let them escape." Jabbar's thunderous voice roared across the camp. Zain and Champa ran for their lives. Behind them, the guards and vicious dogs were closing in fast. Seeing that Zain was falling behind, Champa utilized his natural agility. He scrambled up into the overhanging trees and began hurling heavy rocks, wooden planks, and metal buckets down onto the heads of the pursuers, disorienting them and slowing their pace. Seizing the golden opportunity, Zain threw open the main wooden gates of the compound, and the two vanished into the safety of the dark city night. An unexpected savior and a miracle. Zain and Champa ran through the maze of city streets until their legs could no longer carry them. Dehydrated, exhausted, and bruised, they finally collapsed right outside the gates of a magnificent, sprawling mansion. Zain's consciousness was fading, but Champa frantically patted his face and pulled his shirt, trying desperately to keep his friend awake. Just then, the grand iron gates of the mansion clicked open. An elegant, elderly gentleman stepped out into the crisp morning air. This man was Dr. Amjad, the city's most celebrated and prestigious chief cardiac surgeon. He was heading out for his routine morning walk when his eyes fell upon the heartbreaking sight of a young boy and a protective monkey collapsed on the pavement. "Drive." Amjad immediately rushed them inside his home. He instructed his staff to provide them with warm blankets, fresh food, and hot milk. Once Zain recovered his strength, the kind doctor asked gently, "My child, who are you? And what are you doing out on the streets at this hour with this incredibly loyal creature?" With tears pooling in his eyes, Zain poured his heart out. He narrated everything, how he had rescued Champa in the stormy forest, grandfather's critical illness, their journey to the city to raise medical funds, Jabbar's cruelty, and their harrowing escape. Hearing the profound story of sacrifice, bravery, and the supernatural loyalty between a boy and a monkey, Amjad was moved to tears. He placed a comforting, fatherly hand on Zain's trembling shoulder and said, "Zain, my brave boy, your pure heart and this monkey's incredible loyalty have touched my soul. You do not need to worry about money anymore. Your grandfather's treatment is now my personal responsibility. I will travel to your village with you today, bring your grandfather to my hospital, and perform his surgery completely free of charge." Zain could hardly believe his ears. It felt like a beautiful dream. Champa, as if perfectly understanding the doctor's miraculous words, leapt joyfully into drive. Amjad's lap and gently hugged him, chirping happily in gratitude. Homecoming and peace. Within the following week, Amjad successfully brought grandfather to the city and performed the critical operation. Thanks to the doctor's expertise, grandfather made a swift and complete recovery, his health fully restored. When the family finally returned to their beloved village of Roshanpur, the entire village gathered at the entrance to give them a hero's welcome. The wealthy landlord, who had cruelly refused to help them, stood in the crowd, hanging his head in deep shame. The legendary friendship between Zain and Champa was no longer just an ordinary tale, it had become an immortal symbol of loyalty, love, and devotion for generations to come. Champa no longer needed to perform tricks on the rough city streets for survival. Instead, he spent his days happily curling up in grandfather's lap, racing Zain through the endless green fields, and enjoying the fruits of their beautiful home. They had proved to the entire world that when a bond is forged with true love and loyalty, the connection between a human and an animal can overcome the greatest obstacles on earth.